Hello and welcome to the show. My thanks to Pico for letting us use her music and the lovely track The Sea in Spring. Well, slightly unusual this month because it's just me and our regular guest, who we all know. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, Nick. Great to see you. Thanks for inviting me on again.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. Now it's been a busy year,
Yeah.
and I know things Martian has been busy too.
Mm.
But before we really get started, I want to tell people Kevin has a really, really good book. It's called Mars, A Cosmic Stepping Stone, Uncovering Cosmic Humanity's Cosmic. And I think I've forgotten the last part of the title, but I'm currently reading it. It's on my Kindle right now. And Cosmic Context. There you go.
Well, thanks for saying
But
that. I mean, it's a little bit out of date, Nick. It does cover the foundations why we're doing robotic Mars, but it doesn't cover the curiosity or perseverance. But maybe a second edition eventually. I don't mean that, but I don't not at the moment. But however, it is a subject that's ever changing.
actually, I've quite enjoyed it. In fact, one quote I picked up on straight away was from I think probably the first or second chapter. So I'm getting there. Is our moon also casts a firm hand over our planet's nature and fate. The moon is a planet-sized object, and the Earth and Moon could be almost regarded as a double planet system. I love that
Yeah,
because in so many ways it is so true. Without the tides, I don't think we would have existed.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
And
given,
you're right.
go
We
on.
take it for, yeah, I was just gonna say we take it for granted because it's there all the time. And as you
Yeah.
say, there the effect it's had over billions of years has been just extraordinary, And I mean, it's the first part of the cosmic connection because, we realize that our faith is not just based on the planet, but is determined by cosmic forces, of which the moon and indeed the sun are the most prevalent. So yeah, I mean, we do have to kind of stop and think about it at times, don't we?
Yeah, we're saying that for centuries, it's certainly dominated women's lives, the moon. Um, and for such a long time until the actual advent of a solar calendar, it was how everybody lived. Everything was done to a lunar calendar,
Mm.
um, including planting. The Egyptians took it one step further because they then used the rising of Sirius to predict the Nile flooding
Right,
and all the fertility coming back into the land ready for planting.
right.
So, in a lot of ways, astronomy and the cosmic forces, as you refer to them, are all in effect on our planet.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
and
And
it's
yeah, I was going to say in
well,
researching the book, actually, I suppose, and it always connects to the question of life on Mars. Is we're asking about the planetary connection to life, and a planetary context to origins, and what just in researching the book, it did occur to me, and I'm sure it's occurred to many people that like living on the surface of a planet, it was were the outcome of external forces like the moon and sun, and internal forces from within the planet, and we're almost like the interface between the two. And that really did come across just by just researching aspects of geology and plate tectonics as well as, lunar science, solar science and stuff is that, you know, when we often say going into space, we really are because we're on the surface that interlinks between what's below and what's above. And that's what gives us the dynamism of everything that's changing over time in regard to the biosphere in a way.
right, and of course the way the sun, which is the literally the primary life giver in the solar system, well, certainly for the inner planets,
Mm.
it affects us all. We're seeing the sun obviously in a more active phase right now. Um, I think so far we've had at least four CMEs
Yeah.
in the past week. One of them was an X9 flare.
Incredible.
That's getting
Yeah,
pretty serious. It's pretty serious,
yeah,
particularly for the low Earth orbit environment.
yeah.
The astronauts may have to shelter more often. And of course, a lot of satellites can be affected because the effect of the sun
Yes.
with the CME is that it extends the atmosphere
Mm,
further,
mm,
and a lot of the satellites that we use for day-to-day communication
mm,
um, get grabbed and start to be dragged back in, and not all of them will now have sufficient fuel to avoid
mm.
re-entry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is
Yep.
one of those.
Yeah, again, that and as we become ever more dependent on satellites, we
Mm,
realize that what seemed like kind of almost superfluous irrelevances in the past affect us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I think in one of the recent ones, SpaceX lost 4 or 5 of their Starlink satellites just in one evening. That type of thing. And but of course, the positive side is, and I was reading on the BBC website tonight that there might be nice aurora in Northern Ireland tonight. So I'm not sure if they'll make it as far out as where I am in Dublin, but anyway.
well, I'm in rural Bedfordshire, and unless the clouds decide to completely go,
Yeah,
uh, I might not get to see it either.
yeah,
But as I say, I think at the moment we're still not even at solar maximum. The
yes,
chance we're always going to have a decent chance for a show.
yeah,
The current outlook is not as good as May, but
mm,
it's similar.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it looks like we're going to have a reoccurrence of May, possibly. It won't be as good as May, but hey, we
mm,
have a G class yellow dwarf star. It is it's G2 variable,
yeah,
and now we're seeing it becoming variable.
yeah,
And of course, the other thing is the last real good solar maximum was 1972,
right,
and computers were the size of a room.
mm,
We didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have laptops, Wi-Fi was not in use.
mm,
Um, Certainly, satellite-based internet was not available. And now we're going to see how good our technology really is.
yes, yeah,
Because if we get some really, really good CMEs and flares off the sun,
yeah,
it's going to test the technology.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that it's demonstrated how good
mm,
the solar maximum was in 72. It triggered magnetic mines at sea.
oh my God, it's incredible.
Well, basically, it was during the Vietnam War. So
Mm,
magnetic mines were laid off North Vietnamese ports,
right,
and they all triggered.
incredible,
And
isn't
for
it?
some reason, we didn't know why for a while.
Right,
And for a long time, the actual cause was actually a classified secret. It
right,
was our star having a real fit,
yeah,
and the geomagnetic shockwave
yeah,
was sufficient to detonate these. Everybody thought that a huge number of ships were put to sea, tried to get through the minefield, failed. No, it was literally the solar flare that kicked them all off.
and
And
indeed,
of course,
I was just going to say, almost related to that. In fact, I was reading recently that the radiation detector experiment on Curiosity has actually measured radiation variances of several hundredfold on the
yeah,
surface of Mars because of solar activity. So not only is it relevant, I suppose, to us on Earth, and increasingly because of our dependence on satellites, but certainly for any contemplation of sending humans to Mars, it's a big issue. We got to, time things in relation to solar activity for sure.
yeah, and of course we've got to look really at having habitats which are underground,
Yeah.
and that is certainly this is a nice segue into your article about return to the moon in RTE. I'm going to put it into the show notes. Now the thing is, we're finding um, lava tubes on the moon finally.
Mm,
It's taken a while to say 100% yes, this is a lava tube that we're looking at, not just a crater, but we know it's now a lava tube. The upside of it is it can be used by the personnel on a moon base for a shelter during a severe solar storm.
sure.
Now, obviously, we haven't had anything really severe like a Mickey, hang on, I've got to pronounce this right, a Mayaki event. It
Right.
was so strong, it was recorded in the tree rings
Right.
as sampled by Dr. Mayaki in her PhD, I think it was her PhD thesis.
Right.
And it was it got through to the Earth's surface, and it was recorded.
Right.
Um, it's not an end of the world, unless I don't want anybody to think it's not an end of the world event. Um, Purely because we are a much more sophisticated species.
Mm.
Human beings have the one thing the dinosaurs lacked, and that was a space program.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately, they didn't have a space program. Chicxulub impactor came, it bullseyed the Earth beautifully.
Mm.
You can still see most of the crater. A lot of it's underwater, but it's a very evident crater where it affects the land.
Mm.
There is a similar crater in Canada, and there's similar craters in Australia, as well as meteor crater in Arizona.
Mm.
So we have these time capsules,
Sure.
and we have stepped up to the plate.
Mm.
Both NASA and ESA are working on a asteroid redirect program in order to potentially shift the orbit slightly enough to miss the Earth, which is brilliant.
Mm.
And of course, our moon is a historical record of
Mm.
such impactors. The
Yeah.
late great bombardment was
Mm.
something pretty heavy. We're
Yeah.
not going to see anything like that, I don't think, again.
I mean, apart from even, as you say, any kind of redirect programs, and so let's be clear, we're very early on in that. Nevertheless, one of the amazing things with some of the surveys we're about to do, particularly with LSST, which has been renamed actually, I can't
Era
remember.
Rubin.
Yes, that's it, telescope. Like I was reading somewhere, they may be able to detect all near Earth objects, all down to 100 meters.
Yeah.
Now that's extraordinary. It'll be looking down to a magnitude 28, about half the sky every three, or it's sky every 3 days. So we're talking Hubble sensitivity,
Mm.
probably not far off Hubble resolution. Actually, it's two 8-meter telescopes with adaptive optics, and essentially scanning the sky every 3 days. So it's not just about finding a mechanism for avoidance, it's actually understanding to a very high extent what are the risks and being able to track all of the various objects. So it's funny, I don't know if any of your listeners are huge Elon Musk fans, but the one thing actually, even though we're talking about here the security of the earth, the one thing I don't agree with him, and he's done lots of amazing things, but I don't agree with actually his motivation that we need to send people to Mars to save us from a cataclysmic event on Earth, because I just don't think we'll ever get to that situation, because I think we'll know all of the threats, all of them in the solar system for thousands and thousands of years. Um, and by the time there's any big threat that would, like, I mean, let's be clear, it's going to be millions of years at least before there's a threat for all of humanity on Earth, if even millions of tens of millions of years. But if there was to be anything that was really, really serious coming our way, I genuinely do believe it will be in hundreds or thousands of years when we find other mechanisms to maybe deflect it. I mean, not only actually, I don't know if you saw recently, there was an article where they were saying you don't need to use nuclear weapons for things like, say, offering, momentum change this. Actually, just the X-ray emissions alone might be
Mm.
enough to actually vaporize enough of one of these devices to deflect them just a few degrees if you detect it far enough away. So I think even in terms of asteroid or comet avoidance, we'll come up with very, very clever ways of doing this, at very great distances where the angular displacement needs to be just very, very small. So I think actually you're right in as much as, although we there's limits to our capability in terms of deflecting asteroids and comets. I think actually it won't be that long before we get quite sophisticated in the ways that we can manage that, which is an extraordinary thought. Frankly, I'm not saying it's a guarantee we're guaranteed or we'll find absolutely everything, but I think you're right. We are the first species to, or the first, I suppose, era, even in humanity, to be able to think about controlling our future in that way, which is an
Yeah.
amazing thought. It's amazing. I mean, we're probably about the same age, and I wouldn't have even dreamt of any of that when we were kids. You know what I mean? That we could get to anything maybe like that kind of level of consideration in space exploration, which I think is quite wonderful.
I think the thing is, most of us were brought up, if you if you're our generation and prior, you were brought up on Dan Dare originally,
Yeah.
and then you got Star Trek, and they actually took on
Yes.
the problem in a story,
Mm,
because the Enterprise had to deflect an asteroid that was going to
yes.
wipe out a planet full of
Mm,
indigenous people who were actually Native Americans, been seeded by a race called the Preservers
yes.
onto the planet.
Mm,
And of course, the deflection system that had been left had failed. Thus, the Enterprise was left to try and stop it on its own until they could fix it.
mm,
Well, having said that, we've had what, two movies that have used nukes to try and stop an impactor: Meteor and Armageddon. Of
right.
the two, Meteor was probably the more scientific, accurate in accuracy, because it wasn't using the nuclear weapons to destroy the asteroid.
Yes. Yeah.
It was using the detonation of multiple warheads to actually deflect it, to create a shockwave effect.
Mm, mm,
So I have to say, I think they got it more right, because basically when we did the Didymos impact, we we changed the albedo slightly,
yeah. Yeah.
and that was what changed the orbit.
Mm,
It wasn't actually destroying it.
yeah. Yeah.
And of course, we actually fractured a sizable chunk of it,
Yeah.
which is now potentially a meteor shower stream in
Right.
the near future.
Really? God, I hadn't realized
Well,
that. But
the other
actually,
thing,
it is amazing how much material we could see, couldn't we?
yeah,
Viewed off of it. So, I mean, I thought that was quite interesting. I don't think we were quite expecting that, sure we weren't. So that was I thought it was a tiny little actually warning as to what you're saying is that like which one was it? The not Meteor, you mentioned the movie Armageddon.
yeah.
That you can have this notion of no, you can't break it up because all you do is create more projectiles traveling in the same direction. And I think actually that mission, NASA mission, demonstrates that a little bit because I have to say I was personally quite surprised how much debris we could detect coming off the object once we impacted with it. It was quite amazing.
Well, the other thing was Meteor did address the fact that there was shards of the asteroid
Yes,
preceding it.
yes, yeah,
They did get through
mm,
because they had to save the
yes,
illegally placed nuclear weapons in orbit
mm,
um, to deflect the main body.
mm,
So, in a lot of respects, they
yeah,
actually got it very right because they predicted
mm.
what's going to happen with the Hero missions.
Was Meteor a 70s movie? It's a lot.
I believe so. Sean Connery.
Yeah, there was Deep Impact as well, wasn't it, around the same time as Armageddon?
Yeah,
But actually, you're right in as much as the 70s one, I remember it, and it was quite realistic. And actually, it was during an era of movies, a little bit maybe like what was the one about the Contagion? I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, but it was a 70s era of science fiction movies that were before Star Wars that were quite realistic in their in the way they played
yeah.
things out. So yeah, it was quite a realistic
It
movie.
was a time Hollywood would listen to scientists.
Yeah, yeah,
That wasn't going to happen again until at least until Jurassic Park,
yeah,
because they employed a real paleontologist
yeah.
to advise them about the dinosaurs. And even he said, "Well, guys, they've got feathers."
Yes, yes.
I think Jack Hawkner was
Right.
involved with them,
Mm,
and he was saying, "Look, guys, in reality they had feathers,
mm,
very small, stubby feathers, but the T-Rex, the Velociraptors, well, they were a bit big. But
mm,
since then, we found a Velociraptor fossil
yeah.
that is actually bigger than Blue, the Velociraptor from Jurassic Park,
Mm,
the Jurassic Park, no, Jurassic World."
mm,
But anyway, the whole thing is listen to your scientists when you're making a movie, because I know that was it Neil deGrasse Tyson was forever on Cameron's case over the star field in Titanic
Oh,
because it was
really?
wrong.
Right. My God. Okay.
Um, but it's just those little things. We're even us, even amateur astronomers. We sit there, we watch a movie, says, "Hang on, that does not work.
Well, the
There's
number of science
something
fiction
wrong
movies
here."
with the moon upside down in it is actually
Yeah,
annoying. For
but
some reason,
it still happens.
directors prefer the moon upside down in movie shots. But anyway,
Well, I guess they must have used a telescope to take the shot, because
yeah. Mm,
if I'm just trying to remember now, because binocular views are north to the top, west, east, south.
mm,
Newtonians are north, south, east, west, and reflector or Schmidt Cassegrain is south, north, west, east. See?
right.
Very handy
Oh,
having Patrick Moore's moon map on the wall very
sure.
close by. All these lovely things. But yeah, seriously, if you're gonna take a picture, use a picture of an astronomical or celestial object, get it the right way
Yeah,
around, guys,
yeah,
for the human eyes.
yeah. Well, certainly
Um,
because Titanic was so an iconic movie and so much was in the open skies of the Northern Hemisphere. It's a pity they didn't quite listen to that actually, because I think it would have been, well, maybe for them to have showed the plow in the background or something, it would have been nice to have done it right. I have to admit that would have been, an-
and as I say, there's still controversies going on. Um, Human nature being what it is, we see an object at an unusual angle, and our mind fills in the blanks. The famous faces on Mars, the pyramids on Mars.
Mm,
Um, it is a piece of stone.
yeah.
It possibly that the pyramid one is slightly pyramid looking, but it's just the angle that the camera from space is at
And there
that
was
fools us.
a dead pixel. Now I know the Mars or the Viking images weren't quite pixel, but nevertheless, whatever way they printed it, it was pixelized, and there's a dead pixel right where there should be an eye in
Yeah,
that. So of course they contributed to it. And have you seen that actually Perseverance is just taking a photograph of an unusual rock on the surface that basically looks like a fossilized skull? It's only in the
yeah.
last week or so. So I think actually, yeah, the conspiracy theorists are going to have a field day with this one. I think we expect to see that on Ancient Aliens in the next few months now,
I
So
wouldn't be surprised.
won't stop. It won't stop. Yeah.
I hate to say, I wonder how many of them actually wear tinfoil hats too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
But
I suppose if you don't know, and I suppose not to get too much into it, but if you may remember, Curiosity took a photograph near Mount Sharp of a tiny little cut into a stone face that was about maybe half a meter high, that looks like a doorway into
yeah,
a kind of an artificially cut tunnelway. And of course that's gone like wildfire over the web in the last few years, as being, because if you imagine it as a doorway that's say 2 meters tall, then it really does look like a doorway into some artificial construction. And that's, of course, what many people want to believe, so they'll believe that.
well, I think if you say that it is something and you prepare someone to see something, then they'll see it.
Yeah.
It's like these puzzles that say the first number you see.
Mm.
So you're automatically expecting to see a number, and
Yeah.
your brain is trying to interpret
Yeah.
what it's seeing
Yeah.
as a number.
And
Uh,
none of us are immune from that.
no,
So we're all susceptible to that kind of as a trickery of the mind.
well, I think one of the classic examples is of a stealth plane with its landing lights on coming in at night. All you can see are the landing lights, and occasionally the plane may blot out a few stars. So automatically your brain's going to say, "Oh, that I can't hear an engine.
Mm.
All I can see are these lights, and they're not really where I expect them to be."
Mm.
So automatically you're thinking, "Oh, it's a UFO,"
Mm.
and then it gets out. For instance, I think this goes back to the Apollo era when they were preparing to receive Apollo 11 that splashed out. They had contingency plans for the Mediterranean. So if
Oh.
they had to splash down in the Mediterranean, then RAF Woodbridge would be responsible for the recovery of the capsule and the astronauts.
Mm.
In fact, they were practicing with a helicopter, actually flying with the capsule,
Mm.
and they lost it. They dropped it.
Wow.
Everybody, because they couldn't hear the helicopter or
Mm.
see it properly, they swore it was a UFO that had impacted in the woods nearby.
Right.
Of course, the US Air Force was doing its diligence. They were recovering the boilerplate capsule mock-up because at that time it wasn't known that they were going to come to Britain,
Yeah.
and we didn't know if they're going to bring back any infectious diseases or not. That's why once they were recovered straight to the carrier,
Yeah.
they were put into isolation. 3 missions later, we found out
Mm.
it's, it's not needed. Let's not bother, and they didn't.
That was Carl Sagan's idea.
Yeah.
It's written up in his biography, and even he admitted later in life it was probably just too stringent. But God, the first few astronaut missions or Apollo missions had to go through that. which is a bit of
Well,
a pity because they couldn't come back and really celebrate it. They had to, as I say, put themselves in isolation. But anyway, yeah, Sagan's idea, because he was spawning ideas on, exobiology at that stage.
well, it's not too crazy. We don't know. We at that point we didn't know
No,
exactly what to expect to come back from the moon. We know that from the experiments on the ISS, the medical experiments, that cells can survive in zero gravity and they can survive in the vacuum.
for sure. Yeah,
So we know that in some degree he wasn't being
no,
really out there in the left field. He was probably being very sensible and
yeah,
thinking, well, let's cover all the bases,
yeah.
and that way,
And indeed, funny again, just in researching my book, and I can't find this document online, but I read it online at the time, and it's probably because the book is over about 15 years old. But so what I will say is the web changes and security is tighter. But I remember coming across it was a U.S. Department of Agriculture document, offering basically its stipulation, not guidance,
mm,
stipulation in relation to bringing samples back from Mars. And basically, they were embargoing any samples come back from Mars. And I suppose why I say I don't know whether it still exists. I don't know if that embargo still exists. And here's the power of the U.S. Department of Agriculture saying this was, in fact, what they said was any samples brought back would have to be brought into Earth orbit and incinerated in some incineration chamber on the likes of the ISS, and we could
mm.
only then analyze those incinerated remains, and there would be some scientific benefit in that, by the way. But however, what they were basically on was about was food security, and they were saying that, like, basically the US would embargo any agricultural trade with any country in the world that brought samples back from Mars. So it was effectively a global ban. In the same ways, if you don't get FDA accreditation for a pharmaceutical drug, don't bother because your biggest market is the US. So, I don't know if that still exists, and I know we're talking about roughly a sample, well, hopefully a sample return mission in the next decade if we can get the budget right. But the thing is that I suppose the issue is whatever Robert Zubrin says, and he is adamant there's no risk from bringing, even if there are microbes on Mars, that there's no contagion risk. Nevertheless, when the food security of the planet is at stake, you have to be very thorough about these things. And
Well,
the cautionary principle is important.
you still can't take seeds into America. You can take coffee beans in
Right.
your hand luggage, but you got to declare them.
Yeah.
Anything else that's meat or vegetables, not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the same in here. It's the same in Australia, New Zealand, pretty much anywhere. But you got to be careful. And of course, don't know, Buzz, you remember it, but the Quatermass experiment, the astronaut came back from space and it started mutating into
Yes.
something huge that took over Westminster Abbey. I wonder if that was back in the back of Sagan's mind when he was formulating his
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just an unknown. And I mean, I suppose
Yeah.
when it comes to microbial life, basically, I suppose the point is that even though, as I say, Robert Zubin is adamant that because any such life has not had contact with, Earth's biosphere, so it has no competition. Basically has no immunity of its own, so it couldn't gain dominance. Nevertheless, that's I suppose an argument that applies only to Earth biology as we know it, if you know what I mean. So the resilience of, for example, if there was microbial life on Mars, well, it has been exposed to the wrath of the solar experience for hundreds of millions of years, and maybe more robust, maybe, so there's no real way of knowing, and you've always got to be careful in those regards, in that regard.
Well, the other thing was, if you remember the asteroid sample return, the Cyrus Rex, they were very careful with that. It
Yeah.
could only be opened in the clean room,
Mm.
and they took a lot of precautions, even approaching the return capsule,
Yeah.
which understandably, from the gases being given off, never
Yeah.
mind anything else, but they treated the samples with an awful lot of respect.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I
Uh,
watched it live. Did you watch it live? It was
yes,
extraordinary how many hours just, as you say, approached the capsule, in the middle. Where was it? In the middle of Utah, was it? I think.
something
Um,
like, yeah, it's in one of the deserts, US
they,
deserts.
the protocols were incredibly
They
strict.
closed roads and everything, airspace, roads. all
Yeah.
closed. Anything to get in and out was NASA.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you've got to be careful. And of course, with returning to the moon, we got Artemis on track again. Finally, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, well, it must be rubbish. It failed." It didn't fail. They found safety issues for human flight,
Mm.
and they worked on them. Artemis 2 will be crewed.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny actually. I suppose because Apollo happened so fast, I'm actually kind of picking up again from actually a couple of kind of space scientists I know in the States who are remember Apollo very well. I just not quite there remembering it, but I was born around that time. But the thing is that um. Even if there were issues with Artemis 1, it was a success in as much as SLS worked. Like the Orion capsule did work really well. They what was it, over 5,000 sensors on it. It's a brilliantly designed spaceship, and actually, the thing is, Artemis has to be cost sustainable forevermore.
Mm,
So I mean, I'm this is my pet view on things. I'm not asking other people to view it. Maybe other people want things to happen quicker, but I just don't think we need to rush these things this time around. If we're going back to the moon forevermore, get each mission right. Now, I will admit, 2 or 3 years between missions just is feeling like a long time. But nevertheless, if Artemis 2 succeeds, brings 4 people around the moon and back
mm,
safely, that will have been worth the wait. And then the issue really is more about the lander getting one built, because the SpaceX HLS is just it's actually outrageously ambitious. It's gigantic. It's a 50-meter tall spaceship, and that can be basically just all in one go, land on the moon and take off again. And I don't care how good SpaceX are, it takes a decade to get something of that scale right. I personally think that actually Artemis 3, which they've slated now for 2028, probably won't happen before 2030, because like the smaller landers that were proposed by Boeing originally with SLS was very much based on the Apollo design, and probably would have been built already, and then you've much smaller versions happening by Blue Origin and Lockheed Martin as well. So the thing is that they're going for an outrageously ambitious lander that can what take something like 100 tons
yeah.
down to the lunar surface, which is not needed in the earlier missions in any case. So I think people need to be patient to understand that even SpaceX, they're only a company of 5,000 people, that however good they are, to build a Starship variant called HLS that can land on the moon as a 50-meter tall spaceship and take off again at human rate to work every time. It's just going to take time. So I think personally, Artemis, as long as it's taking, is in a very healthy position, because they're they're being very careful, and we are talking about bringing humans back to the moon over and over and over again forevermore. I mean, there's even talk about, like, I don't know if you saw recently, Artemis 7. So
Mm.
basically, Japanese are building the JAXA with Toyota are building this. Have you seen this designs for an enclosed rover? That's basically like something out of Space 1999. It's amazing. So astronauts will be able to drive for days across the surface without spacesuits on, and that's even in the design phase now. So it's a very ambitious project, and it's probably one really more for the 2030s, but will happen. I really believe it will happen.
Well, interestingly, you're saying that. I'm going back to a two-part show called not Brian May, James May
Mm.
goes to the moon.
Right.
In basically, he went to Houston. He met astronauts. He was tested. Um, he went through a lot of the tests that the astronauts go through,
Right.
and he actually drove a lunar rover that they had built.
Incredible.
And it was 6 wheels. It was articulated in the middle,
Mm.
and it was almost like the dome of a submarine, a bathysphere that
Wow.
goes down to the into the trenches.
Mm.
So it had this huge dome at the front
Mm.
for the driver, so he had unrestricted vision, almost like a fisheye type thing. And it's slow. You want to be slow. You don't want to go herring around because you don't know what you're driving over.
Sure.
The only good thing is the Apollo 11 through 17 dispelled any worries about sinking into moon dust.
Yeah.
So those of us who are old enough remember books like A Drop of Moon Dust by Arthur C. Clarke,
Mm,
in which he said that the dust would be so deep that
mm,
if you didn't land in the right place, you would sink. And
yeah.
his lunar tour vehicle sinks into the dust.
Mm,
Um, but hey, considering the fact that the British Interplanetary Society, when the first V2 hit London, they were in a pub. They ran outside to see what was going on, and apparently they got gloriously drunk afterwards because a real rocket had arrived.
oh my God.
And von Braun was said that he really wanted to go into space. That's what he was, although he knew that they were being perverted for
Mm,
war, he was designing something that could go out of the atmosphere.
mm,
So, and of course, the V2 was the test bed for the nascent American space program
yeah,
and for the Russian space program. They got them as well.
yeah.
But I think Kennedy was a lot more uh, a better organizer. He imbued the program with an awful lot more spirit and determination. And of course, there was
Well,
responsibility.
interrupted you
And
there. Actually, I mean, having watched the Oppenheimer movie, what always amazed me about the Apollo program was, this business of shipping 300,000 people to Florida and achieving it in 6 or 7 years. And actually, if you've seen the Oppenheimer movie, you realize actually that was a second take on a project like that because
yeah,
the actual development of the atomic bomb was basically the same kind of thing in New Mexico where it was about 20,000 people. I can't remember how many people it was. It wasn't 300,000 and it wasn't quite the same budget, but nevertheless, it was a very tight schedule to achieve an extraordinary technical feat, and they achieved it with with room to spare, and so Apollo was almost like a second take on that kind of approach to things. They knew what they were doing by the time it came to the Apollo program, and then of course, as you may know, and I suppose what I love to tell actually about James Webb, the James Webb Space Telescope, is that the administrator at the time, James Webb, who oversaw the Apollo program, was an amazing NASA
mm,
administrator. And there's a famous meeting he had basically when Mariner 5 or 4, I should say, went past Mars and saw craters. NASA themselves got a bit spooked because they had been convinced by the likes of Carl Sagan and Melvin Calvin that there may be some sort of microbial or even possible vegetative life on Mars. When we saw craters, we realized it was dead for a very long time. And so Lyndon B. Johnson was basically going to cancel the budgets for in fact what they'd hoped to do in the 60s was land two landers on Mars called Voyager 1 and 2 on July the 4th, 1969, and they had hoped to land man on the moon on the same day. So they
yeah.
would have put landers on the Mars and man on the moon, and they cancelled the Voyager program. That did get cancelled. We reinvented, of course, as the Voyagers out to the outer solar system. But James Webb met Lyndon B. Johnson in a meeting and secured the future civilian planetary space. Because on a political grounds, he basically pointed out to Lyndon B. Johnson that through JPL alone, they had achieved 30,000 human years of space exploration capability. And he was saying to Lyndon B. Johnson, in a Cold War where space is the frontier, do you want to just get rid and throw away that experience? And not only did Lyndon B. Johnson reverse his decision, but then provided the budgets for what became Viking, Pioneer, Voyager, and potentially even the beginnings of the Hubble Space Telescope. So, there some people have complained about the fact that an administrator was named after, or that the James Webb Space Telescope was named after an administrator. Why wasn't a great scientist? But actually, I won't say Apollo or the civilian space program couldn't have happened without James Webb, but he was truly a really, really good administrator for the space
Oh
program.
yes.
No doubt about it.
In fact, I think there's a famous quote at the beginning of From the Earth to the Moon, the episode Red Moon, and he's told this is what the United States is going to do, and he turns around to his team and says, "Does anybody want my job?"
Wow. Oh my God. Yeah.
I did actually ask about that. It's considered to be a fairly accurate
Wow.
record of how man got to the moon.
Oh my God.
Um, and to be honest, it was very upfront about the fact that if it hadn't have been for the German rocketry people, we
Oh,
wouldn't have got there.
absolutely. No doubt about
Um, so it kept it said a truer version of history
it. Yeah,
concerning the space program. Um, Artemis Gateway is going to be brilliant,
yeah.
uh, and it is necessary. And to be honest, Artemis Gateway home base or moon base alpha, call it what you like,
Yeah,
on the moon is the first major milestones to man on Mars. You
I
you
agree.
can't have
Yeah.
one without the other.
In fact, in researching that article you mentioned for RTE, it really became clear that actually there's a good strategy here. And this was a new term to me that I only learned in May called cislunar space. So that's the next domain.
Yeah.
It's the globe, encompassing the lunar orbit, everything inside the lunar orbit around, from the moon to the Earth, and it's 280,000 times the volume of the Earth. And so the thing is that that's the domain. And again, what maybe many don't realize is that, and this has not been announced, and it's a very recent phenomenon, but China are taking this way more seriously than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. They have a term I can't remember. It's kind of fast. I think it might be fast laning. So people might be aware of it, but China are fast laning the development of a Starship capable rocket,
Mm.
including reusability. In other words, an SLS slash Starship um, um,
Hybrid.
class rocket. They've already developed a lunar lander and also a command module capability to get astronauts from the Earth to the Moon. And China say that they want a lunar base by 2035 in the same region of the South Pole. And they envisage, just China alone, a $10 trillion per year economic transfer between the Moon and the Earth by 2050. And
All that lovely
so,
helium.
so yes, I'll tell you another intriguing use of the moon that I hadn't realized. There's a professor in ESA called Professor Foing, Foing, and he actually came to Ireland last year. He runs actually a kind of a fourth-year program with the university. I mean, brand new university called Technological University of Dublin. And I've only merged with the main campus of this university. And this Professor Fong runs a program, but he has about 800 papers to his name. He's a
Yeah.
huge person in ESA, and it's all about basically the lunar economy and building lunar bases. But one of the major economic benefits of the moon will be to manufacture oxygen and hydrogen from the lunar regolith as satellite fuel. And what he was pointing out was that one of the main economic activities of the moon would be to refuel satellites with thruster fuel or
Yeah.
thruster fuels. And it's 50 times cheaper to manufacture. They envisage it being 50 times cheaper to manufacture it on the surface of the moon and basically take off from the moon, fly it into Earth orbit, and refuel large multi-billion-dollar satellites that otherwise would just crash into the Pacific Ocean, that we would give them 2 or 3 times their life, or refuel a James Webb Space Telescope and this type of thing. So this kind of activity is envisaged on the moon by all parties. So you now have basically two programs going to the moon. You've got the Artemis program, which involves, largely Europe, America, well, America, Europe, Canada, and Japan. And actually, the UAE have just signed up as well to
Yeah.
Artemis. In fact, the UAE are unusual in that they're kind of straddling both spheres, because then now you've got China with the global south. So they have the likes of South Africa and India. I think the UAE are on board as well, to get to the moon as well. And I'll be honest with you, if the thing about the commercialism of the USA is that they have the best of both worlds. They like I know now let's put all of the people who hate Boeing aside, right? Like, because Boeing, as I said to you about an email, Boeing Defense and Space are not Boeing airplanes. They're
Mm.
two divisions in the same corporation. But Boeing Defense and Space have a good track record, back to Saturn V, the first stage. And for example, even all of the people that mightn't realize this, but the radioisotope power that's driving the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers is Boeing built. So that's what's powering these wonderful rovers. But the thing is that the US has the best of both worlds. They have SLS working. It's a good rocket, and it's only costing around 1/6 to launch as Saturn V. So while it's not reusable, it wasn't asked to be reusable. So when people blame Boeing for not building a reusable rocket, I mean, this was air rays from the early noughties, so it
Yeah.
wasn't supposed to be reusable, but it is only costing about one-sixth to launch. So NASA can use it without having to ask for huge budget increases. Now, it's clear when Starship comes along, but it's probably what, 5, 6, 7, 10 years away before it's human rated. Let's be honest here. It will radically change things because it will be partially reusable and hugely more cost effective. And to me, I'm rambling on a little bit here, but I'll just make these points. To me, I wish all of the hate for Boeing and all of the competition between Starship and Boeing and or SpaceX and Boeing and all that would stop because the US actually has the best of both worlds. It's actually a wonderful time. They have an amazing future in rocketry. But the one thing I will say, however, about China is because it is, don't get me wrong, I'm not for a totalitarian regime, but nevertheless, it does drive efficiency. And what you
Mm.
can see happening with the Chinese space program is it's incredibly efficient. I mean, I now believe I can't quite stand over this figure, but only about 5 years ago, China was putting about 6 billion a year into space, about the same as Europe. I'm now convinced China are putting about 17 to 18 billion a year. They're now spending about three times as much as Europe. And that tells you how ambitious they are. But when you look at how they design rockets, like there's been a very standard rocket diameter that they won't move from. And
Mm.
it took basically the Chinese Space Agency to actually convince the Chinese government that they need to widen this for super heavy lift. And that was agreed recently. And now they're on a mission, fast laning these super heavy rocket designs, which they'll probably have perfected within 3 or 4 years. Almost, because there is no competition, because all the money's going just in one direction. There's only one design, and they'll perfect it quickly, and there'll be no wastage in a way. So China, rest assured, I suppose what I'm saying to you, Nick, is that China are on a mission here, and they likely will get to the moon with people, if not as quick as America, maybe quicker, because I personally think the human landing system is so ambitious that I can't see it being successful with people on the moon before, say, around 2032, even though NASA are saying 2028. And that's not criticizing SpaceX. It's just it's an extra if they pull it off, it's science fiction in reality. I mean, this
Oh
is a
yeah.
gigantic rocket, 50-meter tall rocket you're putting on the moon. So it's a very interesting time in as much as I even wonder, will the next humans to land on the moon be Chinese? Because they're adamant they're going to put people on the moon by 2030. That's what they're saying, you know? So it's a
Well,
very,
the interesting thing is that both China and India are now also using the same docking collar as the Americans and the Europeans use.
okay, right.
Because one of the things that was noticed about the Tiong space station, and particularly the latest space capsule being developed by India, that it has the universal mating collar. The
Okay.
Russians are using it because they need to be able to mate to our spacecraft in times of an emergency. And the ISS has the universal docking collar fitted. So it doesn't matter. It could be Orion, it can be Starliner, it can be Dragon. They all have the same equipment for docking to the ISS. So now China has adopted it, and so has India. Now, admittedly, looking at India's designs, it kind of very reminiscent of it looks very Apollo-like,
Right.
um, pretty much. So, well, it's a design we know it works.
Mm,
It's tested, and I think that's, to be honest, that's why Orion
mm,
is the Apollo command module
mm,
on steroids,
mm.
because
It is.
it's a tried and tested
Yeah.
method. We modified the command module itself
Mm,
during the Skylab era to
mm,
be able to take more seats. They could strip out bulkheads and lockers and fit
right.
emergency seating in it for rescue.
Right.
That's why during the lifetime of Skylab, a Saturn 1B was
Mm,
always on the pad. It
yeah.
had the modified command module. So literally two people could go up and bring back the three astronauts on
Yeah.
Skylab.
Very good.
So it's a design. We know it works.
Mm,
It is pretty much copied. I know SpaceX probably going to hate me for this. It is lit. Dragon capsule is
mm,
a variant of the old Apollo command module.
mm,
So is the Blue Shepard version.
Right.
Uh, Definitely Orion. Orion could cruise very much further out beyond the moon if it wanted to. It
Yeah.
has the capability built into it.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I was reading somewhere it's the most sophisticated spacecraft ever to be put into or into space. I mean, it can support four astronauts for 21 days, as you say, beyond the moon. It's impressive. But it is, as you say, the command module on steroids, no doubt about it, but it's wonderful that it's working, it's being tested, and hopefully, let's hope. What they're saying is four astronauts no earlier than September 2025. They used to say slated for 2025, so I know they're being a little bit loose. I'd imagine it'd be early 2026 before Artemis 2 launches off, but that still is only, maybe about 15, 16 months away. So I mean, it's quite exciting. And as you say, the I think what's interesting about what's happening, certainly from the Artemis. So for anybody listening who doesn't know it, Artemis is really a program that isn't just about sending people to the moon. It really encompasses America's view on how they want to engage the moon. And actually, the Artemis Accords are really interesting because they kind of echo the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, where they say, for the benefit of all, that nobody can claim ownership of the moon, and that we'll do things in a sustainable kind of way. And it's kind of unusual. It's kind of contradictory to actually the US. There was a space law put out in 2015 in the US that said that private companies can own what they find on bodies in space. So from an international law standpoint, we're a little bit contradictory there. Russia recently came out and said they wouldn't sign up to the Artemis Accords, which is not actually because there's conflict between the West and the East. They just felt that actually, because it was written by America, it was actually a very Western kind of approach to things. And it was, but they were careful to say that they still adhere to the 1967 Space Treaty. And even though we've got a Ukraine war and all the rest of it, I mean, I like to think that Russia, even today, still do have this 1967 Outer Space Treaty that, there should be collaboration in space where necessary, and we do things for the benefit of all. And I think, if Russia says they're sticking to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, we've got to, take them on their word on that. And I suppose why I'm saying that is that it even echoes, I suppose, the recent Russian astronauts going to the ISS, and that I'd love to think, Nick, that some of these programs, even hearing you saying that the docks are similar design is great to hear, because wouldn't it be wonderful if there had to be a reason why the US and China had to collaborate for some safety reason in space to cool the geopolitics down a little bit, because it would be it's wonderful in one sense to see that China want to get to the moon and America want to get to the moon. It would be wonderful if we could all work together on this, because we could have probably achieved so much more. But nevertheless, to get back to your original point here, because some people say just go straight to Mars. Why don't we do that? Well, you know what? I understand that desire, because I'm getting on a bit, so I'm a bit more rational and reason slow thinking in my brain. When you're young, you just want to say let's go do it, and there's a real argument to say let's go do it. But the problem is, I suppose, is that when you sit down and look at the challenge of sending people to Mars, I like to say it's easily 100 times as difficult and 100 times as costly as sending people to the moon. So the way I like to say this is that, to send, because we're still at the behest of celestial mechanics, even with Starship, with any chemical rocket, you will only get people to the moon when Earth and Mars align every 26 months. And what
Mm.
that really means, therefore, is that you don't have a rocket like in science fiction where you can get over there in 6 weeks and use retro, rockets to slow you down. You have to go there, go into a trans-Mars injection orbit, and use each planet, to slow down. And what that means ultimately, therefore, is a 900-day mission for at least five people. And that's where all the cost is. So even if we're to use Starship, Elon Musk will not be sending people to Mars, landing them there, and coming back several months later. Starship isn't able to do that. So the rocketry is only about 5% of the issues to be resolved. We've got to think about habitats and nuclear power on the surface and in situ resource utilization to manufacture 28 tons of methane to fuel the Mars ascent vehicle to send people back. And we just don't have that technology right now. It's going to be decades to build all of that. And when you look at what they're doing, for example, with the Lunar Gateway space station orbiting the moon, to orbit the moon, which is being built right now. They're building the habitat modules. Europe are building one. America are building one. And then you've got your power, you've got your telecommunications, you've got your power distribution, and so forth. They're building all of these on the Lunar Gateway with a view for these being the template for a spaceship that will go to Mars. So, for example, the mass of the habitation modules in the International Space Station would be a fraction of those of the ISS. It really will be the next generation of space station, even though it'll be smaller, it'll be more cramped and so forth. But it really is a way, as you say, of doing it and trialing the ideas of building some sort of habitat on the moon, thinking about all the issues associated with radiation, thinking about sending people from orbit down to the moon and back. And so they're all the things you'll want to do if you want to send people to Mars and get them safely home to Earth, as John F. Kennedy would say. So the way I kind of say it in relation to Mars is we probably have to get a similar sized infrastructure as the International Space Station over to Mars, some of it onto the surface and some into Mars orbit. And when you think it cost 100 billion to build ISS in low Earth orbit, then just do the maths and figure out how many more hundreds of billions it will be to get that sort of technology over to Mars, down onto the surface, and so forth. So unfortunately, I do think that even with the best intentions, the likes of Elon Musk or SpaceX, I think they're right to say, let's try and go, because that does push the envelope and it forces SpaceX engineers to think outside the box and to build better things and to do them quicker and cheaper and so forth. We're right to aspire to it, but I do think, however, we've got to be sensible ultimately and say that, like, I just don't think we're, as a species, we're quite there to send a human mission to Mars and back unless you're prepared to throw between $1 and $2 trillion into it. If you throw $1 or $2 trillion into it, you might achieve it. But I don't think we're quite there yet. And I don't think you'll get the world, by the way, to hand over $2 trillion, send people over to Mars just at the moment with all the woes of the world.
I think also it will have to be an international effort because I don't see the economy of any one country, even with China's economy and the American economy being what they are,
I agree.
um, being able to support it.
Yeah.
The plus of Apollo was that it took people who are unemployed and put them back to work.
Yeah.
It employed a diverse set of people in order to make the project work. You had people who were originally making bras, stitching gloves for spacesuits
Incredible.
because
Yeah.
they knew how to do the delicate stitches that didn't
Yes.
damage the fabric.
Music. Oh my God.
So you had there was actually technically a depression at that point when they launched the Apollo program,
Right.
but it put so many people back into work because of the sheer technical and national effort required. The tax base actually expanded
Wow.
at the end of it. They got a large portion of what they spent back in taxes because people were working and they were earning money, and it didn't matter how small the project was. It literally paid people's meals, their mortgages, and everything. So,
And the other side is almost like something, say, like a World Cup that might, inspire a country to having won something. I mean, can you imagine the actual the feelings and the of goodwill in the country when it was achieved? That alone would spur on, a kind of an optimism and a re-energized country in a way. So there's no doubt had wonderful benefits in that regard, no doubt.
well, most of the serious sci-fi I've seen recently in the last 10 years
Mm.
for going to Mars has always been an international crew.
Yes, yeah,
You had the BBC Voyage to the Planet. That was an international team on a generation mission, really. It was a very advanced spacecraft. The
yeah,
spacecraft technically did break the outer space test ban treaty. It had an atomic engine.
I know.
Again, that's come back into favor. The old NERVA project NASA had and the DoD and DAPRA had has
Mm.
been picked up again and it's being looked at. We
Yeah,
have ion drives.
yeah,
Everybody thought ion drives were science fiction because that they were talked about in science fiction. People like Asimov, Clarke, Silverberg, Heinlein all talked about ion drives, how they would accelerate spacecraft quicker for trips around the solar system and through the universe. it's basically the impulse drive of Star Trek.
Absolutely.
They're even talking about finding a way to design a fusion engine like Star Trek has for its impulse stack on the
And
starships.
I think there is, you know, I'm not sure again if some of the listeners will realize that when we send, say, a spacecraft to Mars, we stop burning the rocket just beyond Earth orbit, and there's
Yeah.
no drive then. If we want to send people into interplanetary space and, again, not be at the behest of celestial mechanics, we have to have engines like these. And
Mm.
in fact, actually, I kind of find it a bit unusual that there isn't more development, even in the likes of SpaceX, for maybe some sort of nuclear engine or, I say, advanced ion drives, because that has to be the future. If we want to
Yeah.
get across to Mars in 6 weeks instead of 4 or 6 months, we need to be able to actually accelerate en route and decelerate when we get there using, advanced engines. And we're not there yet. But that's where the future of human interplanetary space has to be.
One of the things I noticed about the most recent space probes, New Horizons has an ion drive
Does it?
because it used celestial mechanics to get out
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
but it was able to maneuver sufficiently,
Right. Okay.
select a new target, which is what they did after it went past Pluto. They picked a new target in the Kuiper Belt.
Right.
When we went to Ceres recently, the
Mm.
spacecraft had a non-chemical drive. It was another ion drive. We used it to actually get closer to the surface of minor planets one and two.
Yeah.
And the only way we could do that is not using chemical propellant.
Yeah.
We've been to Hayabusa. We've brought back, we've done the Osiris Rex. These are all missions you can't use a chemical rocket for, chemical motor for, because the spacecraft has to be able to maneuver, deaccelerate, and then insert itself into an orbit, and then get closer to the surface in a controlled and safe manner.
But
Um,
unfortunately for human missions, the amount of energy we're talking about is massive.
yeah,
So we're just not there yet. We are, again, basically using the same technology that was used in 1945 on the V2. It's just souped up. And if we really want to get to Mars long term, we're going to have to, get there with new kinds of rockets. There's no kind of, or engines, I suppose. There's no way around it.
now saying Mars, another subject which we've both been talking about, is of course the lake on Mars. Now, the story basically, for those who don't follow MSN or the Telegraph or whichever paper you like, is that Mars, I think it was Mars Express, was using its radar. It was looking down on the south pole of Mars, and the echoes from the radar indicated a massive subterranean reservoir of water. Now, Cornell University is disputing this. They're saying because of the angles on the ice itself at the southern Martian pole, it could be causing incorrect data. Regardless, the fact that we are seeing this information alone tells us an awful lot about Mars. We believe it is an arid planet on the surface. And to be honest, water can go one of two ways. It can either be boiled off and stripped out by the solar wind because of the lack of Martian atmosphere, the lack of a magnetosphere. And I'm sorry, the idea of detonating two nuclear devices at the Martian poles is not a good idea. Not if you really want to inhabit the planet. The radiation will be quite intense. They reckon that one way to spin up the Martian core. I don't think it's going to work. And of course, again, it's violating the Outer Space Test Ban Treaty. But if we pick the right places to land, we may have the resources that we need.
Well,
South Pole seems to be a good place.
well, I mean, Nick, I suppose whether this state is, this is a false reflection and it's not an underground lake. Can I just add in a few comments on this because it's a big story. If it is so basically they're saying it's a briny liquid reservoir at minus 68 degrees centigrade, but still liquid because it's so salty. So it's just lowering its melting point. But nevertheless, I suppose when you talk about our why are we at Mars for the last 55 plus years, whatever, is to search for life there or evidence of, past life. Indeed, I like to say these days it's gone more sophisticated. We're looking to see what Mars can tell us about a planetary context for the origin of life, because
Mm.
it has a huge record about its early planetary activity still there from 3
Yeah.
billion years ago, because it shut down around 3 billion years ago. So what was going on Earth 3 billion years ago was going on Mars, we think, hydrothermal activity, organic synthesis at hydrothermals and all this kind of stuff, and it's still got a record of it. But the big question, of course, about Mars at that time was, what was the story of water on the surface? And we still don't have a full picture of that, although we see evidence of dried riverbeds and so forth. But nevertheless, if we can say that under the ice cap is a reservoir of liquid water today, as
Mm.
is arid and hostile as it is, that really bodes well for telling us that there was liquid water in the past
Oh
when
yeah.
were more favorable, had a more dense atmosphere. So it is an important thing to get right. I don't think this is by any chance over, because it would be really, really useful to know this. But however, what I will say again for the unsuspecting listener who doesn't know that about Mars, that what we do know is that the northern tundra regions, indeed the southern tundra regions, there's pure water ice just centimeters below the surface to the
Mm.
tune of 5 million cubic kilometers of ice, cubic
Yeah.
kilometers, not cubic meters, cubic kilometers of ice. If we melted all of that, would probably cover the globe to maybe around 30 to 50 meters. And apart from that, beg your pardon, discovery by Mars Express, as we know that there was a more recent announcement a few weeks ago of there was a little lander landed in the Elysium region of Mars, which is very tectonically active still to this day. And it had an amazing seismometer on board that could detect vibrations the width of an atom on the
Mm.
surface. Using its seismic measurements, has detected a vast liquid reservoir underneath it. And scientists have extrapolated globally to say that they believe there's enough underground water to there today. And this is not under the ice cap. This is literally under the ground, hundreds of meters down. That if we brought it to the surface, would probably fill the globe to a depth of, or maybe around several hundred meters. And in fact, to come back to kind of something you raised there, was the question had been, where has all the water gone? And although, as you say, Mars has lost its atmosphere, and we hypothesize that it had lost its water to space. Now,
Yeah.
what the mechanism there is that solar radiation comes in, breaks up the H2O molecule, and then the actual hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms can escape Mars gravity, because the escape velocity is very low. But the thing is that while we could account for losing 99% of Mars's atmosphere that way, we weren't quite convinced that Mars would lose 99% of all of its water that way.
Mm.
And maybe 90%, but we still felt there should have been more water there. And now we think we've discovered it in these vast underground reservoirs of liquid water there. And that is extraordinary, because it tells us that there may be a thermal gradient, that it's warmer under the surface, and actually today is liquid water in vast amounts under the surface, apart from all of the ice we know on the surface as well. So it turns out Mars is a very watery world
Mm.
still, and that's quite extraordinary. But however, to get back to your original point, is it really would be good to know if under that ice cap there is a liquid lake, because that would say even on the surface conditions of Mars, liquid water conditions have been found. And now,
Mm.
as you say, Cornell are questioning that, and they're right to question it. So this is the process of science. We got to take it on the chin if it isn't a lake, and then just move on and accept it. But it's still an open question. Well, in my view, anyway.
Well, the thing is, you mentioning seismic activity inside, that alone has opened up a lot of questions about as to where Mars is in its lifetime, because we believed that it was a bit of a dustbin lid, because
Yeah.
basically there is no continental drift, as we know. There are no tectonic plates,
No.
but there is seismic activity. We now know it exists. There's moonquakes.
Yeah.
The ASLEP experiments were quite categorically proving the fact the moon has earthquakes of its own. Mars now has its own earthquakes,
Yeah.
Mars quakes. So saying 100% Mars is dead is wrong.
Completely,
It's
totally with you on that. Yeah.
it's
It.
it's maybe getting into its old age,
Yeah.
but
Mm.
there is still some activity. Obviously, the core has shut down to a greater degree. And that, if anything, is a warning for us. What's
Yeah.
going to happen when our core cools off sufficiently? We'll lose the magnetosphere, and we'll lose the protection of that we have from the sun.
Yep.
Now, we're
Once
also
you,
there's a lot of controversy about this. There's a lot of conspiracy theory about an upcoming magnetic polar flip. The
mm,
magnetic fields flip. We know that. We look at
yeah,
the rock course of Iceland, which is
yeah,
the best place to go looking at the Earth crust and looking for the magnetogram that shows you the magnetic past of the Earth. We know it's due. The sun's had its magnetic flip already. So it's just a part of solar system life.
yeah,
The Jovian system is a miniature solar system, so is Saturn's.
mm,
With particularly with Jupiter, the Jovian system, Jupiter is really doing a good job as a sun
mm,
without being a sun,
yep,
because the magnetic energy it pumps
mm,
into its own magnetosphere
mm,
is it tidally squeezes its own children.
yes,
It's why
mm,
places like Europa have water,
yes, yeah,
because yes, it's covered in ice to protect it from the vacuum, but the European core is active,
yeah,
and that's because it's being stretched and squeezed, and it's getting energy directly injected into it by Jupiter. It's what the sun does to us.
mm,
So all the inner rocky planets
yeah,
um, get energy indirectly from the sun that
yeah,
we don't see, because as we orbit, the sun actually affects the planets.
mm,
There's It's becoming mainstream that solar weather can affect biologics.
yes, mm,
Um, I'm not going to get into that subject because I don't know much about it. I do know that some of the serious people in the Helios weather and heliophysics are now seeing telltales that biological activity is affected by solar storms.
right.
Um, yes,
Well,
anybody who knows me knows that I do follow space weather, and I follow Dr. Tamita Sarkov. She
mm,
is an absolute godsend
right,
when it comes to space weather.
mm,
What she doesn't know
there's
doesn't
not
need
much
to be
more.
known,
Yeah,
but she teaches it in a way that's accessible.
right,
Um, I will put a link into her for her mini courses,
yeah,
because she won't accept conspiracy theory, and she will explain in without dumbing it down how the sun really affects us.
mm. Well, and this gets back to our original point that we don't live in isolation just on the surface of the planet. We live in a very, very active and dynamic system. And to come back to your point about Mars, it's not dead inside.
Yeah,
We're only figuring out what's going on inside that planet at the moment. In fact, and it has the latest findings, all the findings from inside haven't been released. They're being quite slow about it. I suppose it's to analyze and interpret the data. But the question was, we thought Mars maybe had a very thick crust, and so it was basically a sealed lid, frustrating the release of heat. Now we know Mars crust is not as thick as we thought it was, and it may be a very liquidy core actually, so it's not dead in the core, but it's cooler than we imagined. But it looks like as if the mantle is kind of confused picture there as well. So the thing, what I will say to you, just to come back on a few of the points you've made here is, number one, like Mars has its own natural history to play out. I'm big into this. In fact, as you may know, I'd say that even though I'm in my 50s, I'm still doing my own PhD because I returned from industry to academia, and my PhD is a particular project in astronomy, but not Mars. But as soon as I get the PhD done and off my back, I'd love to get into championing how humans engage Mars somehow formally. And I think that we have to regard it as a special place, because the thing is, this is that I'm not saying don't go there or anything like that. All I'm saying is, if we didn't exist and we let Mars play out, when the sun heats up in a billion years or so, all of that water on Mars will melt. It will become a liquidy planet again. And if there is microbial life there, it may have its own natural history of thriving, living systems. Now, I mean, only for a few 100 million years before the sun goes nova, but nevertheless, Mars might be a planet that actually has a late life, a late thriving period,
Actually,
And that's the life cycle of planets in over their age. And we may have our golden era now and have its golden era in hundreds of millions of years from now. However, we'll have a say on that. And that's why I think it's important about we discuss what's our future engagement with Mars, a planet that isn't like the moon. It has its cycles at the moment, carbon dioxide cycles, its water cycles, it has climate change. We see that through the actual polar ice cap profiles. Um, it's a very, very dynamic place. It's quiescent. It's not dead, as you say.
the only thing I'm going to disagree with you is about the sun going nova, because basically the G2 dwarf, variable dwarf, can't really go nova until it's
Yeah,
become a
sure.
white
Okay.
dwarf.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm going to put that out there because when I'm at some of these lectures that Dr. Sakoff gives, I keep hearing people, oh, the sun's going to become a micronova. It ain't going to happen in our lifetime. We're not going to be around.
yeah.
That is 4.5 to 6 billion years into the future.
But I'm
And
just
for
talking about
micronova, you've got to
the
be
sun
away.
heating up in a billion years or so. It may be enough to vaporize the water on our surface, but
Oh, yeah.
then cause, like as I say, the amount of water on Mars is substantial. If you took all the water on Mars now and melted it and put it on the surface, some people estimate that it could be deep enough to form a global ocean that's between a half a kilometer and a kilometer deep. That's a lot of water. And there's an amazing quote by a student of Carl Sagan's called James Pollock. And I love this quote. It's about life on Earth. Now it's on Earth, let's be clear, but he says, where there's water, there's life, there is no exception. And I think it's an amazingly powerful thought to think that the relationship between my life as we know it and water on this planet, it's a symbiotic relation from day one. So if there's similar kind of microbial life on Mars, the question then is, does it have its own biological natural history still to play out in the far distant future?
One thing that concerns me is, are they actually going to be descendants of any bacteria that got there on the
Oh,
Viking missions?
for sure.
Um,
There's life on Mars right now. It's on several rovers driving
yeah,
around.
exactly. A lot of
Yeah,
the rovers, a lot of the missions post Viking have
yeah,
been much better at at making sure they're sterile when they leave the Earth.
yeah.
Viking was, in a lot of respects, the test bed for
Mm.
the rover missions, for Phoenix, for Insight.
But
For,
nevertheless, again, what's not widely known is that when NASA sterilize probes, they don't sterilize them to protect Mars. They only sterilize them not to give a false positive result in the search for
yeah,
microbial life.
yeah.
And that means that there are bacteria, some of them on the surface of these probes. They're not completely sterilized. In fact, it's probably near impossible to achieve that. So again, getting back to your point that we've seen bacteria survive the vacuum of space. The question is, have any of the actual microbial bacteria that are probably on the surface of these rovers, is it surviving? That's a big question.
Well, another question is: does it mean that Sir Fred Hoyle and Chantanarska were correct
Mhm.
with their spermageia theory that life came to the planet as microbes on meteors, not meteors, on meteorites
Mhm.
and through comet debris? It's just one of those things we're not going to know until we actually get into the Kuiper and certainly get into the Oort cloud.
Yeah.
Pioneer has left the solar system.
Mhm.
It's given us a much better idea of how far our Oort cloud extends. Almost three, was it between half to three quarters of the way to Alpha Centauri is
Probably.
our solar system still. Wow.
Yeah.
Um,
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah.
it's it's been quite a shocker, really,
Yes. Yeah.
and nobody expected it.
Mhm.
The heliopause was an event, but finding out really how big our solar system is
Wow.
and how populated it is, that was definitely thank you, Voyager, thank you, Pioneer. You you gave us the information we just didn't have.
And actually, it's wonderful to think that through probes like this, that we're learning about, the space, interstellar space beyond, as you say, our solar system, or what the outer reaches of our solar system are. I gave a talk on this quite recently. So, I don't remember, there was a space called, it was at IBEX. It was actually able to determine the interactions through particles of the outer heliopause with interstellar space. and was able to demonstrate that actually in a particular direction. You can see the maps of this that we're bumping into. We're, as you know, we're kind of in a little bubble actually of star formation, of which the Pleiades are actually on the outer surface. So
Yeah.
this stretches for hundreds of light years. But the thing is that we can see what we're traveling into in the Milky Way. Then you have the Voyagers that have revealed the outer limits of the magnetosphere of the sun, and now we're beginning to gain deeper insights into the Kuiper Belt, the Oort cloud, and now with projects like, for example, the Pale Red Dot, which is looking at searching for Earth-like planets or Earth-sized planets in nearby red dwarfs, including Proxima b, that we're really actually starting to map the configuration of the Milky Way in the vicinity of our solar system, which I think is wonderful. I tell you, as we suppose come to the latter part of this podcast, and getting back to the China America thing, one of the things I absolutely love about space, and I really do, I mean this never gets old for me, is the notion that irrespective of what the political motivations might be, or irrespective of what politics is going at the moment, that something like astronomy, and there's other human endeavors as well, like music and art, but certainly astronomy does it, is we actually are almost like impervious to those woes of the planet today. We do things that people in 100 years or 150 years can benefit from. And I often kind of think, imagine if there is some sort of interstellar voyage in say 200 or 300 years using a fusion drive at 20% of the speed of light, and that they're using the sort of mapping and that Voyager did, and that this IBEX space probe did, and that the Pale Red Dot project did to aid them and guide them as they make their first steps beyond the solar system. I think it's wonderful that things we do today in that regard may have an impact in hundreds of years, even as to what human activity, is pursued in space, even then.
I think one of the things we have to do is revisit the Bussard ramjet.
Yeah.
Things like Project Daedalus, the British Interplanetary Society's plans for an interstellar spacecraft that could deaccelerate as it homes in on another star, launch probes from itself, and then report home.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's going to take time. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, so they will take a while to get back to us. They will be very quiet. I had a conversation with a fellow radio amateur about this, about space loss, and how you can have a space probe that's blasting away 100 watts. By the time that signal gets back to Earth, it can be a millionth of a watt, which is why you need the big dishes to receive it, because it's such a quiet signal. So you need to pre-amplify the signal at reception. Now, the other thing that came up, speaking to one of my cousins, and he was joking. He says, "You know what the best place to get someone to visit a desert planet? Get someone who's lived in the Negev desert. They will know exactly. They'll have the skills. They will understand from the Bedouin how to live in a hostile environment." So, in a way, yes, it's going to be a massive international effort, even when we finally finish testing all our kit on the moon. Because the moon's close enough. If there's an emergency, we can pull them out. We can get them to CIS Lunar Gateway and get them home if they need serious medical attention. We're developing medical technologies and skills in orbit. On the ISS, they're not just going to zap you home because you've got toothache and you need to have a tooth extracted. They'll do it there. If you need minor surgery, they can do it there. These are all things you need before you go to Mars.
Actually, what NASA still produce are called design reference missions. I think they're on the design reference missions six, 5 or 6. They're about 1,000-page plus document on how to send people to Mars. They've been doing it since the 80s. I think even Robert Zubrin was involved in the first or second design reference missions. And they are basically a template as to how to try to do this. And reading, again, researching my book, I think I read Design Reference Mission 5. And what they were saying was on a 900-day mission, there will have to be 14 operations carried out. So you'll have to have a surgeon on board. And what they were saying was, I mean, some of the challenges of sending people, we've only put people into space for about 370 days, and we're talking 900 plus days. What are the effects of microgravity on not just bone mass, but even on cell metabolism? We don't know that yet. So what they were saying was that there would be several bouts of severe depression. And what they were saying was, imagine if that's your pilot who has to land you down, and they're going through a serious bout of depression just as you need them to be at peak performance, you know? So these are the sorts of issues we have to deal with. If we're going to send people to Mars, it's not it's way beyond just having the rocket to do it. And again, to come back to your point, I think it would be wonderful to see an international collaboration to do this, because you know what, that probably would even speed it up from many decades to just
Yeah.
a few decades away. Because let's be clear, what China are doing these days is formidable. They're on the road, they're really capable, and in space, they are actually just finding cutting their teeth now in brilliant ways in doing that. Like, look at Europe. We've never independently put people into space. China have in only a short decade or so, in terms of their space station. They're catching up very quickly. And if they could, I would love to think there was a not too distant future where Europe, America, Japan, Canada, and China, and India, and so forth, and the Arab states were working together on a mission to Mars. It would be a wonderful, wonderful project for humanity, wouldn't it?
I think the thing is, and up until the Ukraine war, the European Space Agency actually did have the ability to put man in space independently. They were launching Soyuz
Yeah.
missions from Kourou.
Yeah, and even an upgraded rocket. I mean, they contributed to substantial upgrades. You're right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they had the ability at Kourou to do a manned launch.
Well, actually, do you know there's an Irish author, I don't know his name, called Brian Harvey. He writes these wonderful books. He's got one called China in Space, Russia in Space. I just reviewed actually for Astronomy Ireland magazine, Japan in Space. They're really detailed books, but if you take your time with them on a chapter by chapter basis, they're staggeringly detailed. But the one he talks about Europe and Russia, I hadn't appreciated how deep the connection of space between Russia and China is. And in the 1960s, General de Gaulle went to Russia to strike up an agreement for France to work with Russia on space activity. And that's really where ESA came from, was from those verging ideas. And so, like, Europe has been deeply embedded with Russia. The Ukraine war is so sad in as much as the loss of European Russian collaboration in space. You're absolutely right, because actually all of Europe's astronauts were trained primarily with Russia, not with America. And as you say, we developed an incredible capability, and we've lost all of that because of this blooming war. It's very sad.
Unfortunately, as a certain science fiction character has pointed out, we are a very juvenile species,
Yeah.
and because of that, if there is intelligence out there, our solar system is quarantined, unless, of course, we get something like a great dictator in space who wants cannon fodder, and humans are
Yes.
then to be perfect for him or her or it or whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the Vulcans really do exist. They're probably listening to this show when it goes out on YouTube.
Nice thought.
It would
And
not surprise me if there is intelligence that they are. Well, they're getting signals from the 1936 Berlin Olympics. So they're probably getting a very frightening idea of what our planet's like,
yeah.
even though we've got beyond that slightly, and
Well,
we've gone to the moon. They don't know that yet.
yeah, incredible, isn't it?
But
Yeah.
as I say, eventually they'll find out we've gone to the moon, and eventually they'll find out that we're actually transversing the inner solar system
Yes. Yeah.
as crude. I get told I'm old fashioned. I remember, just about remember Mercury and Gemini. I
Yeah.
definitely remember Apollo. I'm
Yeah.
61.
Yeah, I'm 59. I remember Apollo 13. That's my first memory of the Apollo program. I remember sitting with my dad and asking. In fact, when they were docking in space, they were filming it. And I said to my dad, how are we able to see that? And he thought he'd just give me a simple little explanation. He says, "Oh, there must be another ship there with a camera." And then I sat there for the rest of the presentation thinking, "So what's the problem if there's another ship with a camera there?" But anyway, but that's my first memory of it. So yeah.
Yeah, I can just about remember Apollo 1
Oh,
in the
brilliant.
news. Um, so I was what, 4?
Well, actually, just what do you know? What say, Nick? I say to people, all of my aspirations as a child have been met and more. I mean, the likes of Voyager, Mars rovers, and Hubble. That's good enough for me. I'll move on as a contented person. I never believed we'd achieve things. Even, of course, we both will remember before there were exoplanets. I mean, what we're discovering there is just
Yeah.
absolutely incredible. It's a wonderful, wonderful era. And despite, again, all of the geopolitical problems we have, I think what we've achieved in space flight is remarkable. I don't like people complaining that it's 50 years since we went to the moon. My argument there is it's really hard to do. And in the meantime, we've done some wonderful things. And getting back to Mars, the Mars robotic program, because basically Viking was a bit naive and looking for microbes. And then they reset in the 90s. There was a document called the Exobiological Strategy for Mars, written by Carl Sagan and 18 other scientists in 1995, from which then emerged this phased program of Pathfinder, Spirit, Opportunity, Phoenix, Curiosity, and then in orbit, the likes of Mars Express, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. So we've done incredible work on Mars and
Mm.
how well we know that planet, you know. So I think actually not only can we maybe project forward into a wonderful time, maybe if we aspire to this international collaboration, but actually the groundwork we've laid down through mapping Mars down to the meter level mineral, from a mineralogical standpoint, from a topographical standpoint, we have maps of Mars topographically that are better than Earth at 1 meter vertical resolution and 100-meter horizontal resolution. We've done incredible work, and I'm continuing to do it. So for
And
me, my age, I feel as if we've surpassed what we might have aspired. And I'll finish on this, and then maybe we probably need to think about wrapping up soon, do we? But if you I'll say to anybody who remembers the original Carl Sagan Cosmos, go and
yeah,
watch the episode. I think it's what's it, Blues for a Red Planet, where he hypothesizes about Mars rovers in 1980. And if you go back and look at what he had from the Ames Research Center as the idea of a rover, well, Curiosity and Pathfinder blow it out of the water in terms of what we're doing there now. Carl Sagan would be absolutely in his element if he was around today to witness what we've done. We've superseded what he even hoped for, and I think that's saying something.
I think the thing is, the reason I'm looking over my shoulder is because on my bookshelf I have Cole's Tanaka, I can't read the third name, The Atlas of Mars. And just looking at that book alone, the 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 resolution we have of the Martian surface.
Incredible.
Um, a postulation that I've come across is that the northern half, that the way the land mass is, the
Mm,
southern half of Mars is much higher than the north.
yeah,
So theoretically, most of the oceans
yeah.
would have been possibly in the northern hemisphere,
Oh yeah,
and it
yeah.
may
That's
have
right.
actually been a completely water-dominated area.
Mm,
So particularly if you, and even more so when you look at the Valles Marinaris, my
mm,
favorite feature on Mars, that gives us access to the crustal geologic history of the planet. We still quite not sure how deep it is.
mm.
We know it's certainly on the scale of tens of kilometers deep.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So if we get a manned mission that lands near
Yes.
Marinaris,
Mm,
could we not send a balloon
mm,
with a probe down into the depths of the valley and see what's there?
yeah.
It could
Oh,
actually give us a route into
yeah.
the actual internal structure of the planet. There could be caves and stuff that could be eventually accessed by
Absolutely.
human explorers.
Well, I mean, as the Ingenuity helicopter shows us, we can fly on Mars. We with small helicopters. I've no doubt we'll be sending helicopters into Valles Marineris into the future. No doubt, Nick. And as you say, it's a treasure trove of information because the geological layering and the sides of the walls alone will tell us about its past, apart from the depth that as you say it goes to. Yeah, no, indeed Perseverance landing in Jezero crater with fine precision. What was the landing circle was about 3 by 7 kilometers, something which was, what was Pathfinder was 143 by 45 kilometer type of thing. So we can land with precision, which means we can go to more risky areas on Mars ever better into the future. Of course, AI assisted. And so the thing is that like there's a great future, even for robotic missions on Mars. I think it's watch this space. If the funding can be achieved for them, we can go to just when we're only starting to go to the interesting places on Mars, no doubt about it.
Saying that, there's a quote for you. Sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Good old Hal. Poor. Actually, I felt sorry for him. He was programmed to hide the true mission from
Yeah,
everybody,
yeah.
and in the end, it made him paranoid. It made the computer
But
paranoid.
actually, you know something? I like the film 2010 because it reveals all of that. I think it's one of the best made sequels, even though I know the first one's iconic and historic in its capability. I think 2010 did justice certainly to Hal and to that storyline. So it is a sequel I actually really like. You
It,
know,
it was well, definitely a sequel that was a genuinely good film
yeah, yeah,
as a sequel because
absolutely.
it moved the story on.
Yeah.
I've read the 2001 2010 the I think it went up to 4 books in the end, with 3001 being the last book.
Mm.
Um, it it gives a perspective of technological change. Aerobraking is now done.
Yes,
They
yeah,
they they the Russian spacecraft aerobraked in the
yes,
Jovian atmosphere.
yeah, yeah.
It's been done literally on Mars. We did it for real.
Mm.
Um,
No,
so
remarkably accurate. Yeah, I'm very true to the original as well, I felt. So yeah,
yeah,
they did a good
and
job.
of course, I suppose really, particularly here in the UK, like my interest in all this, I blame Patrick Moore. He wasn't a Sir then, so he can't call him Sir Patrick. Arthur C. Clarke, and that chap called James Burke.
Oh my God, what a wonderful, yeah,
Three
wonderful.
people. They were the BBC's panel for Apollo,
Mm.
and their lucid, non-technical
Yeah,
um, descriptions of how, what, and why, and where sold it.
absolutely. Do you remember James Burke's Einstein's Universe for the 100th anniversary of Einstein's
Yeah,
birth in
and
1979?
connections.
Oh my God, that was transformational for me, I have to say. Yeah,
I think his connections, the first series of connections where he takes three ideas and how they all linked in, that was fundamentally
incredible. Yeah.
brilliant because people don't see inventions and science that way. What
Yes.
somebody did in the
Mm.
16th century led to what happened in the 19th century, which led on to what happened in the 20th century. His It all started in the 20th century in Quebec when the power system dropped out.
Mm.
The actual, because of a failsafe initiating, it dumped power into different circuits, which then caused them to dump into other circuits, which caused the blackouts on the east coast of America and in Ontario and Quebec.
Right.
And how do people survive it? And he came up with the answer: in order to survive being put back into the Stone Age, you need a set square and a plough. Because with a set square, you can make a measurement, you can measure angles, so you can measure plots of land. And with a plough, you can turn the land and you can grow food. So even though we've lost electricity temporarily,
Mm.
and we've lost the internal combustion engine because you can't pump petrol
Mm.
or gas as they call it in the States because there's no electric to run the pumps, unless it's an old fashioned hand pump like you get for some of the wells.
Mm.
But finding one of those at a petrol station today's not going to happen. So what do you need to survive
Brilliant.
the loss of technology? Set
Yes.
square and plough.
Incredible. Yeah, and then he had this connections article in Scientific American for many years, which was just wonderful as well. So yeah, brilliant, brilliant man, brilliant.
But if you haven't, if people haven't seen it, look for it.
Mm.
It is on. There are some places online where you can watch the whole thing. He went to 3 seasons,
Right. Yeah.
and it is incredible. One of the things I really enjoyed was his trip to the escape room underneath the launch pad, the Apollo launch pad.
Right.
So he says, this is the point where you take the zip wire and then it cuts. This is where you end up from the zip wire. You
Mm.
go down this chute, and as you go down, you close a series of doors,
Right.
blast doors. and the actual blast chamber, the chamber for the astronauts' refuge, is right under the launch pad,
Wow.
and it has been built so well that if the rocket exploded above them, they're perfectly safe and can be dug out.
Good God, amazing.
But it shows you how they drilled the astronauts on Apollo
Wow.
on the actual escape procedure to get into this redoubt
Mm,
and to keep themselves safe.
mm.
You are literally sitting on a bomb, a chemical bomb.
And actually, I read somewhere that, in fact, the pouring of the water, it was actually to reduce acoustic noise, because
Mm,
the Saturn V rocket would have gone, I think, to 210 or 205 decibels, which would have
yeah.
been enough to crack the concrete underneath the launch pad. And it could be heard 400 miles away on
Yes.
a calm day.
Yeah.
That's the length
Um,
of Ireland, by the way, from the very top tip to the bottom of Ireland, or say from London to, what would that be? Probably Manchester. Would it be quite
yeah.
that? No, incredible.
So that's why the crowd. That's why if you were watching a launch, even to this day at Cape Canaveral, it's
Mm.
still Cape Kennedy. I have it on my repeater list for Hammer to Radio as the Cape Kennedy 2 meter repeater.
Yeah. Wow.
Anyway, so it's a former missile station.
Yeah.
It was handed over to NASA. It became their principal launch station.
Mm.
All the military stuff of the shuttle was done at Vandenberg in California, which is completely separate. And they had to situate the bleachers for people to watch the launches so far away to protect them
Yes.
from the sound alone. Never mind the light, the amount of light being given off by these
Absolutely.
massive J J1 engines.
F1, was it?
Oh yeah, F1. Thank you.
Mm.
That engine is now today on SLS. It's been rebuilt. It's been improved. It's on SLS. I
Wow.
do believe the technology from the F1 engines is actually used by SpaceX as well. I
Right.
know that ULA use it.
Mm.
It's the basis of their Vulcan engine.
Right.
So this is the engine that took man to the moon
Yeah.
and to orbit. We took an intercontinental ballistic missile. We
Incredible.
put a space capsule on it, and we
Yes.
sent a man into low Earth orbit
Mm.
and brought him down fairly quickly. We then used the same missile technology
Yeah.
again to put Germany into space.
Actually, indeed, I was just reading recently. I hadn't quite understood. I wanted to know the lineage of rockets, and Lockheed Martin, or in fact, I think it was the Martin organization, did Gemini, and they were basically repurposed intercontinental
Yeah,
ballistic missiles, the
yeah,
Gemini rockets. I hadn't realized that.
yeah.
And which is great to
The
see a
Agita,
piece of
Gemini
use to
Agita
do.
was the same. It was
Yeah.
repurposed.
Mm.
It was a stage. There's a stage. It was put up. Once all the fuel had gone, it had
Mm.
carried sufficient fuel for maneuvering because they had to dock. In order to actually go to the moon, you
Mm.
had to rendezvous in space
Mm.
with another spacecraft. So that's what the whole purpose of the Agita Gemini missions to prove
Yeah.
rendezvous.
Yeah.
Once you've accomplished rendezvous, now you can start looking to go to the moon. So then they went and they took the command module around the moon and brought it back.
Mm.
Then they started testing the lander in
Mm.
space. They rendezvoused with the lander. They went across to the lander, powered up, powered down,
Mm.
returned to the command module, disengaged, came home.
Mm.
People think, oh yeah, we'll just go straight to the moon. Boom. You can't do that. You can't until Starship lunar lander is
Mm.
ready. You can't launch from Earth,
Mm.
fly to the moon, land, come back.
And
You
even
have
it
to
will be
have
doing that. We'll be bringing people to the moon using Orion or to the Lunar Gateway, and then sending the human landing system from the Lunar Gateway down to the moon. Anyway, so we'll still do that.
2001 all over
Yeah,
again
yeah, yeah,
because you went to the space station in the Orion Clipper.
yeah.
That's what they called it, the Orion Clipper. It had a Pan Am logo on
Mm.
it. You changed the space station for the moon onto something that was basically bullet shaped.
Mm.
It had a bunch of motors,
Mm.
somewhere to stay. You left the space station, you went to the moon, you landed on the moon, and you've got a bus, a lunar bus, to
Very
get
much.
you out to the craters. They've done that. They've created a lunar rover. In fact, even the golf buggy version of
Yeah,
Apollo 16 and 15, 16 and 17, definitely 16 and 17, was a glorified golf buggy,
yeah.
but it worked. It
Uh,
proved the concept
Well,
and it
and
allowed further.
and you're right. And I mean, Lockheed Martin are developing, better versions of that. As I say, JAXA are developing the enclosed pressurized rover, and even both on stateside and in Europe, they're developing like pavement for
Mm.
the lunar base, so you can drive, from one location to another, maybe to the launch pad from wherever the habitat is on the moon, because they just feel in the long term they'll just need small roads on the moon. So we're thinking that way already. We're developing materials, 3D, we'll ultimately 3D print the pavement blocks from lunar regolith on the moon itself. And that's the way we're thinking right now. And there's students across universities all across the UK and Europe on this, just to ready us for this.
Well, that was the whole point of developing 3D printing,
Yeah.
because that way you can make most of your stuff locally when you
Mm.
get there.
Yeah.
Yes, you need some prefab stuff
Mm.
initially, but
Mm.
once you're there, once you're set up, you start producing everything you need there. And that's the only way we're going to be relatively self-sufficient, either on Mars or on the moon or anywhere else in space, is you need to be able to produce what you need. The Star Trek synthesizers,
Mm. Mm.
again, Roddenberry had this brilliant idea. Oh, the computer will create exactly what you want, whether it's food, a beverage, a cup, fork, spoon, whatever, plate.
Mm.
The computer has a template. It's 3D printing in reality.
Yeah.
So my hat is off to you, Gene Roddenberry, because boy, have you got so much right,
Mm.
even if it's a little bit far-fetched and out of here the way you're doing it, using a system where it literally uses energy to create it.
Mm.
But we've got 3D printing now, and that's doing exactly that. It's taking the local materials in and creating what we need.
Well,
Um,
even I mean, the strong thing about Star Trek was even using antimatter engines. I mean, antimatter hadn't been discovered when Star Trek was out. It was only hypothesized, and it wasn't known whether a matter antimatter reaction would produce a huge amount of energy. They just kind of hypothesized it. They probably were finding out what theoretical physicists were thinking at the time, but they used that, and now we know it's true.
yeah,
You get extraordinary amounts of energy from matter antimatter interactions. So they were, yeah, again, very crafty, very clever in
and
their
in some
prediction.
respects, our universe is a bit of a freak because the matter-antimatter balance is more on the side of matter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Unless, of course, in reality, we are actually antimatter.
Mm.
Well, it's a philosophical point. Someone can discuss it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But the observational evidence says
Mm.
we are actually we are matter,
Mm.
positive matter,
Mm.
and the amount of actual antimatter that exists in our universe is very, very small. We can
Yeah.
create it artificially, and we've done it.
Yes. Yeah.
And we know that when the two collide, equal amounts of the two collide, we get a very explosive reaction. It self-annihilates and gives off hard radiation. So who says that Heinlein and Asimov were wrong and Clark was wrong? Clark wrote a paper about giving a hypothesis for a communication system. We have it. That's why the belt's called the Clark belt, because all the satcoms there was
Mm.
from his imagination and his scientific paper.
Mm.
And he was a radar man during the war,
Mm.
along with a very certain person who created Jodrell Bank. He got a whole bunch of ex-military radar sets and aerials, played with them, and started discovering signals from outer space.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah.
Don't know where we're going next.
Well, I
Maybe.
think we need. So I was going to say I need to watch the time, Nick. So just going to
Yeah, I know. I know. We said
talk
an
for.
hour, but we got rambling.
Yeah.
This is the lovely thing about having you on the show, Kevin. Once we get started, we
Well,
lose track of time.
we could go on for another hour or two. I just know I have to watch the time a little bit. That's all I'm saying.
Well, we've done nearly 2 hours, so 1 hour 51 minutes. So I think this is probably a good spot to start wrapping. It's been great having you back.
Absolute pleasure.
If some of those links, if you can send me them, I'll stick them into the show notes, particularly for Sagan's paper and stuff. I'd love to have
Yes.
that as a link.
Okay.
Till
Yeah,
next time, I think.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you
So
very
it's
much
good
for
luck
inviting
for
me.
him.
Pleasure. Yeah. And we'll do it again.
Yeah, certainly. Good night, everyone. Look up, and if there, you may get a chance to see Aurora over the next few nights. The signs are positive. So good night, everyone.